The coat smelled like wood smoke and cedar, and something else entirely, something that had no business making Harriet Bancroft's hands tremble as she smoothed the lapels across her chest and walked through the doors of the territorial courthouse of Santa Fe, New Mexico, on the morning of October the 3rd, 1882. Every head turned. She felt their eyes like the press of hot iron, the ranchers' wives in their starched bonnets, the newspaper men with their pencils already lifted, the deputy marshals standing at the walls with their thumbs hooked into their belts. They looked at the coat first, that long, dark wool duster the color of a winter sky just before it cracked open, and then they looked at her face, and she could see the exact moment they understood. The whispers moved like wildfire through dry grass. She is wearing his coat. She kept her chin high. She kept her eyes forward. Because she had promised herself, standing alone in her kitchen 3 days ago with the wind howling outside and that coat laid out on her table like something sacred, that she would not show them a single moment of doubt. Elias Cooper had given her the only good thing he owned before riding into the worst storm the territory had seen in 40 years. He had given it to her without explanation, without ceremony, had simply draped it over her shoulders and looked at her with those dark, serious eyes and said, "Keep it warm for me." And she had taken that to mean something. She had taken that to mean everything. Now Elias Cooper sat at the defendant's table in irons, and Harriet Bancroft walked to the front row of the gallery and sat down directly behind him, and she watched the back of his shoulders go rigid the moment he registered the familiar weight of cedar and wood smoke entering the room. He turned, just slightly, just enough that she could see the bruise still yellowing along his jaw and the cut above his left eye that had not quite healed, and his dark eyes found the coat first and then found her face, and something moved across his expression that Harriet had no name for, something that looked like a man being both saved and destroyed at the same time. She nodded once. He turned back around before the bailiff could shout at him. The gavel came down. The trial of Elias Cooper, accused of bank robbery, assault upon a lawman, and conspiracy to commit murder, was now in session. And Harriet Bancroft sat with her hands folded in her lap inside his coat, breathing the smell of him, and prepared to fight for his life with the only weapon she had left: the truth. But the truth was not simple. The truth was never simple in the New Mexico territory in the autumn of 1882, and the road that had carried Harriet and Elias to this particular moment had been long and crooked and full of the kind of forced choices that left permanent marks on the soul. It had started 6 weeks ago, on a Tuesday, which seemed too ordinary a day for the beginning of something that would change everything. Harriet Bancroft was 26 years old, and she had been running the Bancroft Station, Way Station, and Postal Depot on the road between Santa Fe and Las Vegas, New Mexico, since her father died of a fever 2 years prior. The station sat at the edge of a wide, flat plain with the Sangre de Cristo Mountains rising in the east, and it was the kind of place where the wind was always working at something: the shutters, the gate hinge, the loose board on the south side of the roof that Harriet had been meaning to nail down since spring. She kept 3 horses in the small stable, offered feed and water and a night's rest to travelers and drovers and mail riders, and she served a simple supper from a cast-iron pot that was almost always on the stove. It was not a glamorous life, and it was not easy, but it was hers, and she had fought to keep it. There were men in the territory who did not believe a woman could run a way station alone. Sheriff Aldous Crane of the Santa Fe County office was chief among them. He had visited twice in the past year to suggest, in the particular way of men who do not expect to be refused, that Harriet might consider selling the station to one of several interested parties he just happened to represent. Harriet had offered him coffee both times and declined his suggestion both times, and the second time she had also mentioned, with a pleasantness that she did not entirely feel, that her father's deed was properly filed and recorded, and that she had a copy in 3 separate locations, So any interested party who thought they might circumvent the process through misfortune would be disappointed. Crane had smiled at her. It was not a warm smile. She had bolted the door after he left. So Harriet was already living inside a quiet siege on the morning that Elias Cooper appeared at her door. It was just after 4 in the morning, dark still. The sky a deep purple-black with a rim of cold light beginning to show along the eastern mountains. She heard the horse first, a single horse, moving slow and careful, which was not the pace of a rider in trouble, but was also not the pace of a rider with nothing to hide. She was already awake, already dressed, because Harriet Bancroft slept lightly and carried a small derringer in her apron pocket during the hours when the station had no other guests. She lit the lamp in the front room and went to the door and called through it. "Station's open, state your business." A pause, then a man's voice, low and unhurried. "Looking for water for the horse, and if you have it, something to eat, I can pay." The voice did not sound desperate. It did not sound drunk. She unbolted the door. He was tall, broad in the shoulder, with dark hair that needed cutting, and 3 days of beard on a face that was neither handsome nor hard but somewhere in the contested territory between the two. He wore a canvas riding coat over a plain flannel shirt, dark trousers, and boots that had been good once. He held his hat in his hand, which she took as a reasonable sign. His other hand was loose at his side, well away from the revolver on his hip. He was perhaps 28 or 29 years old, and his eyes were the color of the mountains at dusk, a dark, complicated brown that had seen more than it was ready to describe. "I've got water in the trough around the back," Harriet said. "Take your horse there first. I'll start something on the stove." He did. She watched from the window, one hand in her apron pocket as he led the horse to the trough, let it drink at its own pace, spoke to it once in a quiet voice she could not hear through the glass. He did not nose around the stable. He did not look at the rear windows or test the fence or do any of the small surveying things that a man planning trouble would do. He was simply a tired man watering a tired horse. She put coffee on and sliced bread and cut cold beef from the piece she had left from supper, and when he knocked at the door again, she let him in and gestured to the table. He sat. He ate with the focused efficiency of a man who had not eaten in some hours but was too proud to show urgency. He drank the coffee black and did not ask for sugar. He put a silver dollar on the table without being asked, which was more than she charged, and when she pushed the change back at him, he shook his head. "Keep it," he said. "The coffee's worth it." She sat across from him because she always sat with her guests rather than hovering at the stove like a servant in her own house, and she looked at him directly because she had learned that men revealed more when a woman looked at them plainly than when she looked away. "You're riding late," she said. "Early," he corrected. "Or late, depends on which direction you're coming from." "Which direction are you coming from?" He looked at her steadily. "East. Las Vegas. Near there." She let the silence sit. Outside, the wind pushed at the shutters. "You're Harriet Bancroft," he said. It was not a question. She felt the small, specific alertness that came when a stranger knew her name before she'd given it. "I am," she said, keeping her voice level. "And you?" "Elias Cooper." The name meant nothing to her then. She would later think about that, about how a name that would come to matter more than almost any other name in her life had arrived so quietly, without fanfare, just a man stating himself at 4 in the morning over a plate of cold beef. "Are you in trouble, Mr. Cooper?" she asked. He considered the question more seriously than most people would. "Not right at this moment," he said. "I'm working on staying that way." It was an honest answer. She appreciated honest answers. She gave him another cup of coffee and let the matter rest. He stayed until the sun was up, sleeping 2 hours in the chair by the stove. She had offered the second bedroom, but he said he was fine where he was, and she had the sense that he wanted to be near the door, and then he saddled his horse and rode west toward Santa Fe. He touched the brim of his hat to her as he went. She stood on the porch and watched him go and told herself that the particular quality of the morning light was why something in her chest felt strangely incomplete as he disappeared around the bend in the road. She did not expect to see him again. He came back 5 days later. This time in the afternoon, this time with a bag of dry goods strapped to his saddle that turned out to contain a pound of good coffee and a small can of molasses and a paper of sewing needles. And he said without any preamble, "I used more than $1's worth of your hospitality and I'm not comfortable with a debt." And she stared at him on her porch for a moment and then laughed, which was not something she did easily or often, and said, "All right then. Come in and I'll put the coffee to use." He stayed the afternoon and helped her nail down the loose board on the south side of the roof, which she had been meaning to do for months, and he did it well and without requiring instruction. And when he climbed down from the roof and she handed him a cup of the new coffee, he said, "Does this station always operate with just the one person?" "It does since my father passed." "That's a lot of work." "It's my work," she said. He nodded, and she had the clear sense that he understood the distinction, that she was not complaining and was not asking for his pity, that she was simply stating the nature of her life, and that understanding meant more to her than she wanted to admit. He rode out again before supper but said he would likely be passing through again in the week. She said the station was open to travelers. He looked at her briefly with those dust-colored eyes and she looked back at him, and something passed between them that was not yet anything but was no longer nothing. He did pass through the following week, and the week after that. By the third visit she knew that he was a man living at the edge of something difficult, and that the something difficult was connected to a man named Warren Galt, who ran a significant portion of the territory's illegal cattle trade out of a ranch south of Las Vegas, and that Elias Cooper had, at some point in his recent past, been employed in Galt's operation and had gotten out, and that Galt did not take kindly to men who got out. She did not know all the details. She knew enough to understand that he was not simply a drifter, that he had been someone's man and was now trying very hard to be his own man instead, and that this was the kind of transition that happened in blood, in the territory, in 1882. By the fourth visit she knew his horse was named Calico on account of the patches of color in the mare's coat, and that he took his coffee black out of habit and not preference, because he actually preferred it with a small amount of sugar, which she discovered by accident when she left the sugar bowl on the table, and he used it without thinking, and then looked slightly caught. She knew that he had grown up in the Texas Panhandle in a family of cattle people who had not been rich but had been decent, and that his father was dead, and his mother had remarried and moved to Missouri, and that he did not visit her as often as he should, which he said with a flatness that suggested it was a source of specific, well-worn guilt. She knew that he had done things he was not proud of while working for Warren Galt, and that he was working on determining whether those things could be balanced against future behavior or whether they were simply a permanent ledger that had already determined his outcome. "Do you think a man can change what he's owed by the world?" he asked her once, sitting at her table with his coffee, the autumn light coming through the window sideways and making everything amber and warm. She thought about it properly because it was a proper question. "I think the world doesn't keep much of a ledger," she said. "I think it's other people who do, and other people can be convinced." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're an unusual woman, Harriet Bancroft." "I'm a practical one," she said, "which amounts to the same thing out here." What she did not say, what she was only beginning to understand herself, was that she had started watching for him. That on the days she thought he might come, she made the coffee stronger and put the good cups out instead of the chipped ones. That when she heard a horse on the road, she went to the window with a particular quality of attention that was different from her usual watchfulness. That when she lay awake listening to the wind, which was always, she sometimes thought about the precise weight and texture of the silence between his sentences, and found it strangely comfortable, like a room she had lived in for years. She had not been in love before. She had been practical her whole life, had not had the luxury of being otherwise. She was not sure she was in love now. She only knew that the station felt different on the days he wasn't there, and not in the direction of peaceful. The fifth visit was when things changed in a way that could not be unchanged. He arrived in the middle of the afternoon, and she knew immediately that something was wrong. He was riding fast, and he did not slow to his usual easy pace as he came up the road. He brought the horse around to the back without coming to the door first, which he had never done, and when she came out the back she found him at the water trough with his hand pressed to his side and blood dark through his fingers. "Mr. Cooper," she said sharply, starting toward him. "It's not deep," he said, and from the steadiness of his voice and the color still in his face she believed him. "Knife, not bullet. I need to wash it and wrap it, and then I need to be away from here." "You need to come inside," she said. "Harriet," his voice was low and urgent. "The men who did this may be following the road. I don't want to bring this here." "If they're following the road they'll see your horse at my trough regardless," she said. "So you might as well come inside where I can clean the wound properly. Bring the horse into the stable, and I'll close the doors." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite name, and then he did what she said. And she took that as a significant concession from a man who was not built for following orders. She cleaned the wound at her kitchen table with boiled water and carbolic, which she kept for this kind of occasion because the territory had a way of creating them, and the wound was a shallow slice along his right side that had bled dramatically and would be sore for a week but was genuinely not dangerous, and she said as much, and he exhaled with a controlled relief that told her he had been less certain of that than his earlier reassurance had implied. "Who did this?" she asked. "Two men who work for Galt," he said. "I think he sent them to carry a message rather than finish the job, the message being that he knows where I am. Which means he might also know that you've been coming here." He met her eyes, and the acknowledgement in his face was immediate and heavy. "Yes," he said. "I'm sorry. I was careful, but I wasn't careful enough. That was my mistake, and it puts you in a position you didn't ask to be in." "I've been in difficult positions before," she said, wrapping the clean linen around his ribs with efficient hands, working close enough to him that she was acutely aware of the warmth of his skin and the controlled steadiness of his breathing. "Galt. That's the same man who Sheriff Crane works with." He stilled. "You know about Crane. I know he's tried to run me off this land twice and that he represents buyers whose names he won't give me. If those buyers are Galt's people, then I was already in the position before you ever stopped here for water." She tied off the bandage with a neat knot and sat back. "So you can stop looking like a man who's just delivered terrible news. It was already my news." He looked at her for a long, searching moment, and she thought she saw something shift in him, something that had been braced against a wall for a very long time beginning, cautiously, to consider whether the wall was entirely necessary. "You're not frightened," he said. "I'm always frightened," she said. "I just don't find it useful to advertise it." And he smiled then. It was the first time she had seen him fully smile, not the brief, private, almost smile that passed across his face sometimes when she said something that caught him off guard, but a real smile, warm and sudden and transforming, and Harriet felt something release in her chest with a force that was almost painful. He stayed the night. She gave him the second bedroom this time, and he did not argue, and in the morning she made breakfast and he helped her with the morning water work and the stable feeding, and they moved around each other in the small kitchen with a natural ease that should have required more time to develop and had not, apparently, waited for permission. "I need to go into Santa Fe," he said over breakfast. "There's a man there, a deputy U.S. Marshal named Holt, who I've been in contact with. I have information about Galt's operation, names, locations, dates, enough to bring a federal case. Holt has been trying to build that case for 2 years, and I'm the piece he's been missing." Harriet set down her coffee cup. "You're going to testify against Warren Galt." "I'm going to try to. It's the thing I can do that balances the ledger a little. The information I have, I was in a position to have it because I was in the operation, and I was in the operation because I made choices I shouldn't have made. Giving it to Holt doesn't undo those choices, but it might prevent the ones that Galt is planning next." He paused. "There are people who will be hurt if Galt isn't stopped. Not just inconvenienced, hurt." He's moving toward controlling the water rights on 3 separate river tributaries, and if he does, a dozen small operations, farms, ranches, way stations. He stopped. Way station, Harriet said quietly. It's not the reason I'm doing it, he said, and his eyes were very direct. I want you to know that. I was on this road before I knew your station was here. I would be doing this regardless. But it's a reason, she said, a beat of silence, charged and careful. It's become a reason, he said. Yes, she looked at her coffee cup. She looked at the window. She looked back at him. Then you need to be careful going into Santa Fe, she said. If Galt knows you're on this road, he may already have people watching the approaches to the city. I know, he said. I'll take the long way through the canyon road. It adds 4 hours, but it avoids the main approach. And if this Deputy Marshal Holt can be trusted, what happens after you give him the information? Galt gets arrested. His organization gets broken up. Federal case gets tried in the territorial court. It takes months, probably, but it starts. And you, she asked, what happens to you? He was quiet for a moment. That's the part that's less clear, he said. I was part of the operation. I committed crimes. Holt has said he can offer protection for my testimony, but whether that translates to immunity from prosecution it's less certain. So you might go to prison. I might, he said simply. Harriet stood and took their cups to the stove for more coffee, not because she wanted more coffee, but because she needed a moment with her back to him, because her face was doing something she was not ready for him to see. She poured the coffee and kept her breathing even and thought, this is a man who is choosing the right thing knowing it may cost him everything. She thought about all the men she had known in her life, her father included, who could not say the same. She brought the cups back and sat down. Then you'd better make sure Holt's offer of protection is in writing before you say a single word, she said. He looked at her steadily, and she saw the thing in his eyes again, that complex and barely contained feeling that she did not yet have a name for but was beginning to suspect named itself in the small hours when she was not thinking about it. I will, he said. He left that morning, and she watched him ride down the road toward Santa Fe, and the day was ordinary and the sky was ordinary, and the mountains were exactly where they always were. And Harriet went back inside and washed the breakfast dishes and told herself very firmly that she was not going to worry. She worried every minute for 3 days. He came back on the 4th day, late in the afternoon, and she heard the horse and went to the window and saw it was him, and felt the thing in her chest release so sharply she had to put her hand on the windowsill. He came inside with a cautious energy that was not quite relief and not quite dread. He said that he had met with Holt. He said that Holt was a genuine federal officer, not one of Crane's men, and that the offer of protection was real and was, as Harriet had suggested, being put in writing. He said the formal testimony would be given in Santa Fe in 3 weeks and that until then he needed to stay out of Galt's reach. You could stay here, Harriet said before she had fully decided to say it. He looked at her. It's a station, she said, keeping her voice matter-of-fact. I have the room. You'd be off the main road. And you could help with the roof. There's the north side now as well. A quiet moment in which the air between them seemed to make a decision of its own. All right, he said. He was at the station for 3 weeks, and those 3 weeks were the most fully inhabited weeks of Harriet's life. She was not a romantic. She had not grown up on stories of love as a soft and gilded thing. She had grown up on dry winters and sick horses and account books that never quite balanced, and love had seemed to her, from the outside, to be a project of considerable risk for uncertain return. But she found, with Elias Cooper in her station over those 3 weeks, that love was not a soft thing at all. It was more like the mountains, something large and foundational that had been there before you noticed it and would be there long after, and noticing it did not make it smaller, only made you understand that you had been living in its shadow without knowing the source of the shade. They worked together in the mornings, the station work and the repair work, moving around each other with a comfort that had settled in almost from the beginning. He was good with his hands and did not require direction, and did not offer it unless asked, which were both things she valued. She cooked, and he did not assume it was her role and his right. He asked, and she said yes because she genuinely liked to cook, which was different from being assigned to it, and he seemed to understand that difference without needing it explained. They talked in the evenings. Properly talked, the kind of talking that moves through the surface layers of opinion and fact and arrives somewhere more essential, where a person's actual shape lies. She learned that he had a dry, particular humor that surfaced unexpectedly, and that he could argue a point with intelligence, and give up the point with equal intelligence when he was wrong, which she found rarer in a man than it should be. He learned that she had taught herself to read land surveys and legal documents after her father's death, because she needed to understand what she owned and how to defend it, and that she had opinions about territorial land policy that were both detailed and correct. He said he thought she should be in the territorial legislature. She said they did not allow women in the territorial legislature. He said he thought that was a significant loss to the quality of territorial governance. She looked at him to see if he was teasing. He was not. There were evenings when they sat on the porch in the darkening after supper, the mountains black against a sky going slowly through its colors, and neither of them spoke for long stretches of time, and the silence was the kind she had read about once in a book and had not believed in as a real thing, the kind that is comfortable rather than empty, the kind that is full of a presence rather than an absence. He touched her hand one evening, just that, his hand over hers on the porch railing as they watched the first stars come up, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that until the temperature dropped and drove them inside, and neither of them said anything about it, and neither of them needed to. 2 days before the scheduled testimony, he kissed her. It was evening. She was washing the supper dishes. He was drying them, and she said something about the Galt case that made him turn to her. And when he turned, she was already looking at him because she was always looking at him when she thought she could do it without being obvious. And he looked at her for a moment that stretched beyond the capacity of ordinary moments. And then he set down the dish he was holding and took the one from her hands and set it aside too. And he put his hands on either side of her face with the careful, reverent attention of a man who is holding something he is afraid to damage, and he kissed her. It was a simple kiss, unhurried, gentle, and completely devastating. She kissed him back and put her hands on his chest and felt his heartbeat under her palms, steady and real, and thought, "Here is the thing I didn't know I was waiting for. Here is the shape of the shadow I have been standing in." He pulled back and looked at her, and his face was open in a way she had not seen it before, the careful, managed front of a man who had spent years protecting himself temporarily dismantled, and what was underneath was something so earnest and uncertain and warm that it almost broke her heart. "Harriet," he said. "Yes," she said, which was the answer to the question he hadn't asked yet, and they both knew it, and his forehead came down to touch hers, and they stood in her kitchen with the water cooling in the basin and the stars coming up outside and the whole complicated world momentarily suspended. "After this is over," he said quietly, "if it goes well, if Holt's protection holds and the case comes together and Galt goes down and if I'm still standing on the other side of it, I would like to stay. If that's," he stopped. "I don't know how to say this without it sounding like too much." "It doesn't sound like too much," she said. "I'd like to stay," he said simply, "here with you. If you'll have me." Harriet Bancroft, who had been practical her whole life, who had not had the luxury of being otherwise, held the face of Elias Cooper in her mind like a lamp held up in a dark room and said, "I will have you. I will very much have you." He kissed her again, and this time there was nothing tentative about it. That night was the first night she slept fully, without waking, in 2 years. The next morning they woke to trouble. It was Holt who brought it, riding hard from the direction of Santa Fe before the sun was all the way up, his horse blowing steam in the cool autumn air. He was a lean, weathered man in his 40s with a federal marshal's badge and the particular focused energy of someone who is trying to stay ahead of a situation that is trying very hard to get ahead of them. He came inside and stood in her kitchen and looked at Elias and said, There's been a complication. The complication was this. Warren Galt had gotten word that Elias was cooperating with the federal investigation. Harriet did not ask how, because the how did not matter at that moment. What mattered was that Galt had sent 4 men to Santa Fe the previous evening, and those 4 men had found the boarding house where Elias had been staying before moving to the station, and finding him gone, had started asking questions in the way Galt's men asked questions, which was to say with money and the threat of its absence. Somebody had told them about the station on the Eastern Road. "How much time do we have?" Elias asked. "Could be this morning," Holt said. "Could be tonight. I came straight here when I got the news, but I can't be certain how close they are behind me." "Then I need to ride," Elias said. "I'll draw them away from the station." "No," Harriet said. Both men looked at her. "If you ride," she said, "and they catch you on the open road, you're alone. There's no help coming and no defense." She turned to Holt. "You're a federal marshal. Do you have the authority to take custody of Mr. Cooper and transport him under federal protection to Santa Fe for his testimony?" Holt blinked. "Technically, yes." "Then take him, under federal protection, directly to the courthouse. Galt's men can't touch a federal prisoner without bringing federal charges down on themselves, and if Galt is already looking at a federal case, he won't want to add to it." Holt looked at Elias. Elias was looking at Harriet with an expression she recognized now, that complicated, almost overwhelmed look that she was beginning to understand was what Elias Cooper looked like when someone surprised him in a way he found deeply important. "She's right," Elias said. "Of course I am," Harriet said. "Go, both of you, now." Elias went to get his horse, and for a moment it was just Harriet and Holt in the kitchen, and Holt said, quietly and with a respect that seemed genuine, "He's a lucky man, Miss Bancroft." "He's a good man," she said. "Make sure the court understands that." Holt nodded. He went outside. Elias came back in for his saddle bag, and she was standing in the kitchen doorway, and he stopped in front of her. He looked at her face for a long moment, memorizing it or storing it somewhere, and she let him, looking back. "This will be all right," she said. "I know," he said. And then, because he was an honest man, "I hope." He started to go. Then he turned back, and he took off his coat, the long dark wool duster that was the only good piece of clothing he owned. The coat she had seen him in every single time he came to her station. The coat that smelled like wood smoke and cedar and the cold mountain air of the road they had both been living on, and he held it out to her. She looked at it. She looked at him. "The storm coming over the mountains," he said, and she looked east and saw it, a dark bank of cloud moving with a speed and purpose that meant business, the kind of storm that dropped temperatures 20 degrees in an hour and turned roads to mud, and made the canyon road he would be riding impassable by nightfall if he didn't make it through in time. "You'll need it more than I will. Holt's riding fast, and I'll keep warm enough moving." "Elias, keep it warm for me," he said. And there was something in the way he said it that was not just about the coat. That was about the everything. About the after and the staying and the promise that was still open between them, unfinished but real. She took the coat. She put it on. It fell to her knees, and the shoulders were wide on her, and it smelled like him, and she held herself very still and looked at him. "Ride careful," she said. "I'll come back," he said. He went. She stood on the porch and watched him and Holt ride west at speed, the storm rolling in behind them from the east, and she wrapped the coat around herself and she thought, "Come back. Come back, come back." The storm hit 2 hours later, and it was as bad as the sky had threatened. It came in like a judgment, wind and cold rain that turned to sleet on the east face of the mountains, and hammered the station roof, and put the lamp in the front window in serious danger. Harriet spent the afternoon boarding the shutters from the inside, and moving the horses from the small stable to the main building's lean-to, and doing all the work that a storm in the New Mexico territory required. She did it wearing Elias' coat, and she was not sentimental about it. She was warm, which was the point. But she was also not entirely unsentimental, because no one is made of stone, and she was not trying to be. That evening, one of Galt's men came. He was alone, which told her the others had either taken a different road or been delayed by the storm, and he came to the front door openly and knocked, because he was not, apparently, the kind of man who bothered with subtlety. He was large and weathered and looked like someone who had started conversations with his fists for so long that words had become an afterthought. "Woman," he said, when she opened the door with her hand in her apron pocket around the derringer. "The man called Cooper. He was here." "Many travelers come through this station," she said. "He was here," the man repeated. "Regularly, I know that. I'm asking where he's gone." "A federal marshal came by this morning," she said. "He took a man into custody. I didn't ask questions. I'm a way station, not a law office." The man studied her. She held his gaze. "If you're lying," he said. "I'm not in the habit of it," she said. "Now you're welcome to take shelter from the storm in the stable at the standard rate, or you're welcome to ride on, but I'm going to shut this door either way because it's cold." He stood there another long moment, and she kept her face entirely neutral and her hand around the small gun in her pocket. And finally, he turned and walked back to his horse and rode on through the rain. Harriet shut the door and leaned against it and breathed. She got word 3 days later from a male rider passing through that Elias had made it to Santa Fe, that Holt had him in federal protective custody, and that the testimony had been given and was part of the formal record now. She got word 1 day after that Warren Galt had been arrested at his ranch near Las Vegas by a team of deputy federal marshals. She stood in her kitchen reading the male rider's brief written summary and felt something large and knotted release in her chest. Then, 4 days after that, she got a letter from Holt. The letter was brief and written in the direct manner of a man who considered himself giving information rather than delivering news. It said that Elias Cooper's testimony had been accepted by the federal prosecutor and would be the cornerstone of the case against Warren Galt. It said that the question of immunity for Elias was, as he himself had told her, less settled. It said that the local Santa Fe County authorities, specifically Sheriff Aldous Crane, who had now been identified as having a corrupt arrangement with Galt's operation, had filed charges against Elias Cooper for crimes committed during his time in Galt's employ. Specifically, participation in a bank robbery in Las Vegas in January of 1882, assault upon a lawman, and conspiracy to commit murder in connection with a cattle dispute that had turned violent the previous summer. Crane was trying to bury Elias Cooper before the federal case could protect him. The letter said the trial date had been set for October the 3rd. Harriet read the letter standing in her kitchen in Elias' coat, which she had not stopped wearing in the cold mornings and evenings since he left, and she felt the anger come up clean and sharp and cold, the kind of anger that does not flame out but burns steady. Crane was doing this because Elias' testimony threatened Galt, and Galt's connections included Crane, and Crane was trying to discredit or eliminate the witness before the federal case came to trial. It was a trap, plain and clear, and Elias was sitting in it while Crane held the door shut. She thought for 3 hours. She wrote 7 drafts of a letter and threw 6 of them away. Then she put on her boots and her coat, Elias' coat, and rode into Santa Fe. She went to see Holt first. Holt received her in his office in the federal building, a spare room with a map on the wall and coffee on the stove, and he looked at the coat and said nothing, which she appreciated. "What do you need from me?" she asked without preamble. "I've got the charge of assault on the lawman," Holt said. "The lawman in question is one of Crane's deputies who was running interference for Galt's operation. I can challenge the validity of the charge. The conspiracy charge is shakier. That was an incident with 2 of Galt's men and a third-party rancher, and there's no clean evidence either way. The bank robbery is the problem." He paused. "Cooper was there. He was part of the crew that robbed the merchant's bank in Las Vegas in January. He didn't pull the trigger, no one was killed, but he was a participant. The evidence is solid." "What was his role?" Harriet asked. "He held the horses outside the bank," Holt said, and then, at her expression, "I know. But holding the horses is still participation in a robbery, and under territorial law it carries significant weight." Is there testimony that could establish he acted under coercion? Holt looked at her steadily. Do you know something I don't? I know that a man working for Warren Galt in 1882 was not in a position to decline assignments without consequences, she said. I know that 2 men who worked for Galt attempted to put a knife in Mr. Cooper's side last month, and I have the bandages and the carbolic bottle to prove it. I know that Galt's operation ran on the explicit threat of violence toward those who refused to participate or who tried to leave. She paused. If there's a legal argument to be made that his participation in the robbery was not freely given, I can provide evidence that speaks to the pattern of coercion in Galt's operation. Holt was quiet for a moment. He stood up and poured them both coffee, which she had noticed was how he processed information, and he stood at the stove looking at the map on the wall. There's a lawyer, he said. Name of Marcus Frey. He does civil work mostly, but he's handled some criminal defense and he's good. He's not corrupt, which in this county is worth noting specifically. If Cooper had representation going into this trial, real representation, not the court-appointed kind, and if that representation had access to the testimony you're describing about Galt's coercive practices, there might be a case to be made. Where do I find Marcus Frey? Harriet asked. She found him 2 streets over in an office that was small but organized, which she took as a good sign. He was a compact, precise man of about 50 with spectacles and an excellent memory, and he listened to her for 40 minutes without interrupting, taking notes in a small book, and when she finished he said, "The coercion argument is viable. It will be difficult. Crane is clearly trying to use this trial as a political action rather than a legal one, which means there will be pressure on the judge. But a well-constructed defense that attacks the validity of the charges while establishing the context of Galt's coercive operation, combined with Mr. Cooper's cooperation with federal authorities could succeed. Could succeed, Harriet said. Nothing in law is certain, Frey said, but I believe it is winnable. Then take the case, she said. My fee, I have the deed to a way station on the Eastern Road, and I have my father's savings, which are modest but real, she said. Tell me what you need. He told her. It was most of the savings. She said yes without hesitating. She went to see Elias. He was being held in the county jail, which was under Crane's jurisdiction, which made Harriet's jaw tighten as she walked through the door. But the jailer was a young man who did not appear to be invested in the politics of his superior, and led her through to the cells without too much difficulty when she said she was a material witness in the case. Elias was sitting on the bunk in the cell with his elbows on his knees and his head down, and when he heard her step he looked up, and the look on his face when he saw her. When he saw the coat was the thing that had brought the gallery to whispers, and would bring Harriet back to the center of herself for years afterward whenever she recalled it. It was not a simple expression. It was a man who had been carrying a very heavy weight in a place that did not permit him to put it down, and who, in the space of seeing her, was momentarily permitted to remember that he did not have to carry it entirely alone. She came to the bars and put her hand through, and he came to the bars and took her hand, and they held each other through the iron, and she thought, I will not let them do this to him. I will not let them use him as a lever against himself. Frey is your lawyer, she said. He's good and he's honest and he knows the argument. Harriet, he said, with the quality of a man trying to say several things at once and uncertain how to choose among them. I told you I'd keep it warm for you, she said, meaning the coat and meaning everything. So you'd better come back and get it. He laughed briefly, and it was a slightly broken laugh, the kind that lives very close to the other thing, and he pressed his forehead against the bars and she pressed her hand against his face, and they stayed like that for a moment in the bad light of the county jail. I'm sorry, he said, for bringing this to your door. You brought it to your own door long before you came to mine, she said. Now stop apologizing and tell me everything Frey needs to know about Galt's operation and the coercion you were operating under. Every specific instance, every name and date you remember, all of it, he told her. She listened with complete attention and no flinching, and when he was done, she squeezed his hand and said she would be back in the morning with Frey. And she went back to Frey's office and gave him everything and watched him make his notes. And then she found a boarding house that would take her, and spent the night in a room that smelled like old wood and lye soap, lying awake with the coat pulled over her like a blanket, thinking through the shape of what had to happen. In the morning, she went to the courthouse early and filed herself as a material witness for the defense. The trial of Elias Cooper lasted 3 days, which was longer than most trials in Santa Fe in 1882, where the court's docket was always full, and the pressure to move quickly was constant. Marcus Frey was methodical and composed and absolutely rigorous, and Harriet watched him work with the pure satisfaction of someone watching a tool used exactly as it was designed to be used. The charge of assault upon a lawman was the first to go. Frey established, through the deputy's own testimony, that the incident in question had occurred when the deputy was operating outside his jurisdiction at Galt's explicit direction, and that Elias had struck the man in response to the deputy drawing his weapon without provocation. The judge, a federal circuit court judge named Holloway who had been brought in from Albuquerque specifically, because Crane's connection to the case made a local judge problematic, sustained Frey's challenge to the charge, and it was removed. The conspiracy charge took longer. Frey attacked it from 2 angles. First, that the evidence connecting Elias directly to the planning of the violence was circumstantial and insufficient, and second, that the charge had been constructed by Crane's office specifically to impair the federal investigation, which Holt testified to directly, his federal badge giving his words a weight that the territorial prosecutor struggled to overcome. The charge was eventually reduced to a lesser count of failing to report a crime, which carried a fine and no prison term. The bank robbery charge was the hardest and the most important, and Frey spent the better part of the second day building the context of Galt's operation. The systematic intimidation, the specific and documented violence against those who refused assignments, the pattern of coercion that meant that a man working in Galt's employ in January of 1882 was not a free agent making independent decisions, but a person operating under implicit and explicit threat. Then Frey called Harriet. She walked to the witness box in Elias' coat, and she sat down, and she told the truth. She told it without embellishment and without theater, and without a single word that was not directly relevant and accurate. She described the men who had come to her station on separate occasions, Galt's men both times. She described the knife wound she had treated on Elias' side, the wound that had been inflicted by Galt's men as a warning. She described the man who had come to her door in the storm after Elias' departure, the implicit threat in his presence, the way Galt's operation moved through the territory like a pressure system that made free choice simply not available to those inside it. She watched the jury. She had grown up reading people the way her father had taught her to read weather, by looking at what things were doing rather than what they were saying. 3 of the 12 jurors had shifted toward her in the first 5 minutes of her testimony. 2 more had moved by the time she described the knife wound. By the time she described the storm and the man at her door, she had a majority of them. She was almost certain. Frey asked her one final question. He said, "Miss Bancroft, in your observation and interaction with the defendant Elias Cooper over the past 6 weeks, what was his primary motivation in cooperating with the federal investigation of Warren Galt's operation?" Harriet looked at Elias, who was looking at her. She held his eyes. "He wanted to do the right thing," she said, "even when it was going to cost him. He had done wrong and he knew it, and he wanted to make it right as much as he could make it right, and he was willing to pay whatever that required. That is not the behavior of a man defined by his worst moment. That is the behavior of a man who is more than his worst moment." The silence in the courtroom after she said that was the particular kind of silence that lives just before things shift. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. The verdict on the bank robbery charge was not guilty on the primary count. with a finding that the participation had occurred under documented coercive conditions that substantially mitigated the defendant's culpability. A secondary count of misdemeanor participation carried a fine, the same modest fine as the reduced conspiracy charge, and no prison term. Elias Cooper was a free man. Harriet was standing in the gallery when the verdict came down, and she felt the wave of it move through her from her feet upward, a huge, slow relief. The kind that comes after you have been bracing against something for so long that releasing the brace is almost like grief, almost like joy, actually something between and beyond both of them. Across the room, Elias turned in his seat and found her immediately, the way you find a fixed point in a disorienting space because you have memorized it without intending to. He looked at her. She looked at him. She pressed her hand to the front of the coat over her heart. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. His eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with composure. The procedural aftermath of the verdict took time, documents to sign, fines to arrange, the formalities of processing a man back out of the custody of the court, and Harriet waited in the hallway outside the courtroom with a patience that cost her considerably more than it looked like. She watched Crane leave through a side door with the particular hunched fury of a man whose plan had failed completely. And she made a note to speak with Holt about the additional investigation of Crane's corrupt arrangement with Galt, because that particular thread was not yet finished, and she intended for it to be. Then the doors opened and Elias came out, and he was still wearing the clothes he had arrived in, the plain flannel shirt and dark trousers, no coat. And he saw her and crossed the hallway in 4 steps, and she went toward him in the same moment, and they met in the middle. And he took her face in his hands and kissed her right there in the hallway of the territorial courthouse of Santa Fe, with the newspaper men watching and the bailiffs watching and the ranchers' wives watching. And Harriet put her arms around him and kissed him back, and did not concern herself one single bit with any of it. When they separated, she began to take off the coat. "No," he said, putting his hands over hers to stop her. "Keep it on, it's cold out." "It's your coat," she said. "You're cold," he said. "We'll negotiate the coat's permanent ownership later when we're somewhere warm." She laughed, and it was the real laugh, the full one that she didn't give easily, and he smiled at it with his whole face, that transforming smile that she had been cataloging since the first time she saw it, and she thought, here is the thing. Here is the actual, specific, permanent thing. Holt found them in the hallway and shook Elias' hand with a genuine warmth, and said the federal case against Galt was moving to trial in the spring, and that Elias' testimony would be needed again, and that Holt's office would handle transport and protection for that appearance, without requiring any additional risk from Elias in the meantime. He looked at Harriet and said, "Your witness statement was the strongest thing in 3 days of testimony, Miss Bancroft." "If you ever want a career in law, I have a career," she said pleasantly. "But thank you," he smiled. He went. Marcus Frey was next, and she paid him the remainder of what she owed him, and he took it with the precise dignity of a man who earns his money and is not embarrassed to receive it. And he said he had enjoyed the work, which she believed. And he said that if she ever needed legal assistance again he was available, which she filed away for later. Then it was just the two of them, and the afternoon light coming in through the courthouse windows, and the world rearranged into something new. They stayed 2 nights in Santa Fe, both staying at Harriet's boarding house in separate rooms, because it was 1882 and they were not yet married, and Harriet Bancroft had a practical relationship with the opinions of the world she lived in, even when those opinions were inconvenient. They spent the 2 days in Santa Fe doing the things that needed doing, speaking to Holt's office at length about the Crane investigation, which Holt confirmed was already underway, and which would result in Crane's removal from office, an eventual federal indictment the following spring, and walking through the city together in the cool October afternoon, and talking in the easy, ranging, full way that they had been talking for weeks, except now without the shadow of the trial over it. Now with a lightness underneath the conversation that had not been there before. On the second evening, they sat at a table in a small restaurant near the plaza, and it was warm inside, and the food was good, and there was a lamp on the table between them. And Harriet looked at Elias over the lamp and thought about all the small, precise ways that the world had reorganized itself to produce this moment, and was conscious of being happy, which was not a sensation she had extensive experience with, but which she recognized with something like wonder. "I want to talk about the after," Elias said. "All right," she said. "I said I wanted to stay," he said, "at the station with you." "You did," she said. "That is still my intention," he said, "unless you've changed your mind." "I have not changed my mind," she said. "Then I want to do it properly," he said. He was looking at her with the direct, serious attention he gave to things he had thought about carefully. "I want to marry you, Harriet, if you'll have me. If you think that's, I know it's fast. I know my record is not exactly Elias," she said. He stopped. "Yes," she said. He blinked. "Yes, you think it's fast." "Yes, I'll marry you," she said, and laughed at his expression, and he laughed too. And the restaurant was warm and the lamp was bright between them, and she reached across the table and took his hand. They were married 3 weeks later in Santa Fe, in the simple civil ceremony at the courthouse that was available and efficient and entirely legal, with Holt as witness and a local woman named Mrs. Avery, who ran the boarding house and had taken a decided interest in the whole situation, as the second witness. Harriet wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that she had made herself, and Elias had acquired himself a new coat, a good one, charcoal gray, properly fitted, which meant the dark duster could retire to its role as Harriet's, which she had already claimed without formally declaring it. After the ceremony they rode east, back toward the station, and the road was familiar under them, and the mountains were the same mountains, and the sky was the enormous New Mexico sky going from blue to gold as the afternoon advanced, and they rode side by side in the easy, comfortable silence that had been theirs since almost the beginning. When the station came into view around the last bend in the road, Elias slowed his horse and looked at it for a moment, the small, solid, practical building with its porch and its stable and the north side of the roof properly nailed down, and then he looked at Harriet. "Home," he said. It was not quite a question. "Home," she confirmed. He smiled. They rode in. The winter of 1882 to 1883 was a working winter, the kind that builds things. There was the station to run the travelers and mail riders and drovers who moved through regardless of the season, and the spring planting to plan, and the water arrangements to formalize now that Galt's organization was broken, and the threat to the river rights had been eliminated. There was the small matter of Elias building a proper second stable on the north side of the property, which he did over the course of 4 cold weeks in December and January, with the focused, precise craftsmanship that Harriet had come to understand was one of his native gifts. They argued sometimes. They were both people with strong opinions who had managed their own affairs for years, and there were negotiations about the account books, about the station fees, about how much of Elias' particular brand of quiet stubbornness Harriet was willing to absorb before naming it clearly. And the negotiations were sometimes heated and always honest, and resolved with the mutual respect of two people who had enough regard for each other to take the argument seriously rather than deflecting it. They also loved each other with a completeness and depth that Harriet had not known to expect, and that she thought about sometimes with a kind of private astonishment. That this was possible, this specific, particular, daily experience of being known by someone and knowing them, of having a person whose presence filled the space of a room, and whose absence created a specific quality of incompleteness. And that it had arrived in her life through a series of contingencies so particular that any one of them being different would have led elsewhere. In the spring, Elias gave his testimony again in the federal case against Warren Galt, and Galt was convicted on 6 counts of fraud, coercion, conspiracy, and illegal appropriation of public land, and was sentenced to 12 years in the federal penitentiary. Sheriff Crane was indicted on corruption charges the same month and removed from office, replaced by a man named Reyes who was honest and competent, and who made a point of stopping at the Bancroft station whenever his rounds brought him east, which Harriet appreciated. In the summer of 1883, Harriet discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Elias at supper on a Tuesday evening, which seemed, again, too ordinary a day for something so large, and he sat with it for a moment in the way he sat with important things fully, without rushing toward a response, and then he looked at her across the table with his whole face open and said, "Harriet," in a voice that contained everything he was feeling without managing to organize it into any more specific statement, and she smiled at him because she knew what he meant. Their son was born in March of 1884, in the second bedroom of the station, with the help of a midwife from the nearest town who had attended half the births in the county. They named him Thomas James Cooper, for Elias' father and Harriet's. He had Elias' dark eyes and Harriet's particular quality of focused attention even from the very beginning, which caused Elias to say that the child was going to be formidable, and Harriet to say that this was the plan. The station grew. They took on a second hired hand in 1885, a quiet young man named Beaumont who had come west from Missouri and was steady and good-tempered and excellent with the horses. They expanded the stable and added a small bunkroom for travelers who needed more than a chair by the stove. Harriet formalized the postal route through their station with the Territorial Postal Service, which brought a reliable and regular income that anchored the finances in a way the variable traveler trade could not. In the fall of 1885, their second child arrived, a daughter they named Clara Ruth, and where Thomas was intense and focused, Clara was immediately and evidently going to be the kind of person who walked into a room and made everything move in her direction without appearing to try. And by the time she was a year old, she had everyone in the station, Beaumont included, organized to her satisfaction. The years were not without difficulty. The territory was still rough, still contested, still a place where the law's reach was uneven, and the gap between its intention and its practice was wide and sometimes dangerous. There were disputes over water rights, different ones. Now that Galt was gone, the smaller and subtler disputes that always filled the space vacated by a larger threat, and there were hard winters and the occasional traveler who needed more help than they were willing to ask for. And there was Elias' recurring guilt over the years in Galt's operation that surfaced sometimes in the middle of the night like weather, and that Harriet had learned to address not by reassuring him into silence, but by sitting with him in it, by saying, "I know, and it matters, and you are more than it." But the good things were also real and also permanent. Thomas Cooper, at age 4, could name every horse in the stable, and had their temperaments analyzed to a degree that made Beaumont openly envious. Clara Cooper, at age 2, had developed a communication system with her father that appeared to consist primarily of him making specific faces, and her making specific faces back, and both of them finding this satisfactory. Elias had built a proper reading corner in the front room with shelves that Harriet filled methodically from the catalog of a bookseller in Albuquerque. And on winter evenings, the front room of the Bancroft station was warm and lamplit, and full of the particular domestic noise of a family inhabiting a space together. In the spring of 1887, they made a trip to Missouri. Elias' mother had written 3 times requesting it, and Harriet, who had a view of guilt as an obligation to be discharged rather than carried indefinitely, had said that they should go, and so they packed up Thomas, now 3 years old, and Clara, not quite 2, and Harriet, 5 months pregnant with their third child, and the 4 of them made the long train journey east, because by 1887 the rail line had reached far enough into the territory to make the journey manageable. Elias' mother was a small, sharp-eyed woman named Ruth Cooper, who had evidently passed her cheekbones and her directness and her private humor to her son with equal measure, and who looked at Harriet for about 30 seconds on the front porch of her Missouri house and said, Well, I can see why he came back, and then went inside to put the kettle on, and Harriet decided immediately that she liked her very much. The visit lasted 2 weeks, and it was, Harriet thought, genuinely healing for Elias in ways that were difficult to articulate and important. The specific guilt about his mother, about the years of distance, about the things he had not told her and could not now tell her directly, was met by Ruth Cooper with the particular practical grace of a woman who has decided to love her children exactly as they are and not as she might have preferred them to be. And the two of them sat on her porch in the Missouri evenings and talked in low voices while Harriet put the children to bed. And when Elias came inside afterward, he was quieter in a way that was the quietness of something having been released rather than suppressed. On the train home, somewhere in the long plains of Kansas, Thomas asleep against his father's arm and Clara asleep across Harriet's lap, Elias looked out the train window at the moving dark and then looked at Harriet. "Thank you," he said, "for making me go." "I made a suggestion," she said. "You made the choice." "You know what I mean," he said. "I do," she said. She shifted carefully not to wake Clara. "Are you all right?" He considered it honestly, the way he always considered honest questions. "Yes," he said. And then, with the particular quality that came into his voice when he was saying something he had thought about for a while and was now choosing to say out loud, "I feel like someone who has been carrying a pack for a long time and has set it down. I know the things I did are still things I did, but I also know who I am now. Both things are true, and I think for the first time I'm genuinely all right with both of them being true at the same time." Harriet looked at him in the moving light of the train window. Her husband, the father of her children, the man who had stood on her porch one October morning and taken off the coat he was wearing and put it around her shoulders and said, "Keep it warm for me." And she thought about the long road that had brought them both to this particular seat in this particular train on this particular night, with the dark continent rolling past and the future ahead still wide and unwritten. And she felt the gratitude of it like a physical warmth. "Both things can be true," she said. "That's exactly right." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him and they watched Kansas pass in the dark. And Thomas didn't wake, and Clara didn't wake, and the train moved steadily west. Their third child, a boy they named Henry Marcus, the Marcus for Frey, who had remained in their lives as a friend and occasional legal advisor, and who received the naming honor with characteristic precision and genuine pleasure, was born in August of 1887, healthy and loud and determined about it. He had Harriet's coloring and Elias' stubbornness, which combination Beaumont, who had by now been with them for 2 years and was as much family as employee, said with affection was going to be extremely entertaining to observe. By 1889, the station had been running under their joint management for 7 years and had become one of the most reliable way stations on the Eastern Territory Road. Travelers recommended it. Male riders requested the route. There was a small local reputation for the quality of Harriet's cooking and the quality of Elias' horsework and the quality, generally, of the Coopers as people honest, fair, not to be taken advantage of, but genuinely hospitable in the original sense of the word, which means treating the stranger at your door as someone whose humanity you take for granted. Thomas, at 5, was attending a school that had been established in the nearest town by a teacher from Ohio named Miss Gallagher, and had already presented Miss Gallagher with his analysis of why her classroom organization could be improved, which she had received, apparently, with the patience of a saint and the private amusement of someone who knows they are dealing with an unusual child. Clara, at 4, had developed a deep friendship with the daughter of a neighboring rancher named Santos, and the two of them spent so much time between the two properties that Harriet and Senora Santos had long since made the practical decision to feed whichever children turned up at mealtimes and keep a general account. Henry, at 2, was currently most interested in the stable and the horses, and would need to be extracted from the vicinity of the horses' feet on a daily basis for reasons that appeared, to him, to be entirely unclear. In the October of 1889, on a day when the Sangre de Cristo Mountains were doing the particular thing they did in October, going red and gold and amber in the slanted autumn light, Harriet stood on the porch of the station and watched Elias come across the yard from the stable with Thomas riding on his shoulders and Henry trotting alongside with his small, purposeful gait, and Clara coming out of the door behind her to push past her and run toward them. And she stood with her hand on the porch post and watched her family move through the October afternoon and felt the full weight of it, the years and the choice and the cost and the gift, all of it at once, the whole specific irreplaceable particular of it. Elias saw her standing on the porch and said something to Thomas that made Thomas laugh, and then he lifted Thomas down and came up the porch steps with the easy stride that was completely his, and he stood in front of her and looked at her face with the attentiveness that had never decreased in the years she had known him, that quality of looking at her as though she was something worth the attention, something that did not become ordinary simply because it was familiar. "What?" he said, smiling slightly. "Nothing," she said. "You're thinking something considerable," he said. "I'm thinking something considerable," she agreed. He looked at her for another moment. He put his hand against her face, the way he had in her kitchen the first time he kissed her, the way he still did when he wanted to be fully present with her. "Tell me," he said. She thought about the coat. She thought about the storm. She thought about the trial and the hallway of the courthouse and the sound of the verdict coming down. She thought about the station in the early mornings and the lamp on the table and the books on the shelves and the 3 children in various states of chaos in the yard. She thought about the long road in and the truth of where it had brought them. "I was just thinking," she said, "that it all worked out." He looked at her with his whole face, the smile and the history and the warmth and the love that was not a soft thing but a foundational thing, the kind that had been there before she noticed it and would be there long after. "It did," he said. "It really did." The mountains were red and gold in the October light, and the children were loud in the yard, and the station stood solid on its ground, and Harriet Cooper stood on her porch inside herself and was, quietly and completely happy. Inside, on the hook beside the door, the old dark wool duster hung in its permanent place. It still smelled, faintly, of wood smoke and cedar and cold mountain roads, and Harriet still wore it sometimes in the sharp early mornings when she went to check on the horses before the day properly started, and it still fell to her knees and the shoulders were still wide on her, and she had never given it back and he had never asked for it. Some things you give away and mean to reclaim. Some things, when you give them, you know on some level deeper than thought that you are giving them for good, that the giving is the point, that the coat is never really about the coat. Elias Cooper had known that on a morning in October of 1882 when he draped a duster over a woman's shoulders and said, "Keep it warm for me," knowing he was riding into a storm and not knowing what was on the other side of it. And Harriet Bancroft had known it too, when she buttoned it closed and walked through the doors of a courthouse and sat down behind the man she loved and wore his gift like a declaration, like a flag, like a promise made in public. She had kept it warm for him. She had kept all of it warm for him. And he had come back, and he had stayed, and the story they had made together out of the raw materials of a difficult world was, in the end, the best kind of story. The kind that does not end cleanly because it does not end at all. The kind that goes on in the quiet daily accumulation of a shared life, in the mornings and the evenings and the arguments and the laughter and the children growing and the seasons turning and the mountains always there, red and gold and permanent in the east.